Hello, you're watching Ukraine This Week. Join me, Jonasz Rewiński, as we examine the situation on the battlefield, both in terms of politics and literal combat situation. Russia has intensified its drone assault on Ukraine, launching 78 UAVs overnight on the first day of December. Air defenses intercepted 32 of them, while electronic warfare neutralized a further 45. Despite Ukraine's advanced defensive measures, however, Russian strikes have increasingly targeted civilian areas, causing significant casualties.
For the third month in a row, the number of Shahed kamikaze drones launched by Russia at Ukraine has surged to record levels. According to figures from Ukraine's Air Force, Moscow launched over 2,500 drones during November, up from 2,000 the month before. Notably, a missile strike in the Dnipropetrovsk region killed 4, including an 11-year-old boy. Additionally, Russia targeted 14 settlements in Kherson, Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions, causing multiple injuries and fatalities due to persistent shelling and drone attacks.
On the 30th anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy criticized the agreement, stating it hasn't worked for a single day. The memorandum, signed in 1994 by the United Kingdom, the United States and Russia, provided security assurances in exchange for Ukraine renouncing its nuclear weapons.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy emphasized that promises are insufficient for true security, calling instead for real alliances and robust internal defenses. Historians noted that Kyiv agreed to the deal under immense pressure, with Russia manipulating global narratives to discredit Ukraine's sovereignty and justify disarmament. Many have called the decision to relinquish nuclear weapons a mistake. Despite growing calls to strengthen its defenses, Ukraine remains committed to nuclear non-proliferation, according to Foreign Ministry spokesperson Georgi Tikhi.
Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski walked out of the OSCE Ministerial Council meeting in Malta to protest against the presence of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, accusing him of lying about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Delegations from the Baltic states and the Czech Republic also left during Lavrov's speech, while US Secretary of State Antony Blinken remained.
Radosław Sikorski denounced Russia's violation of European borders and human rights, asserting that the OSCE's principles have been undermined by Moscow's actions. Lavrov, making his first EU visit since the 2022 invasion, claimed the West was waging war through Ukraine. Lavrov's appearance was enabled by OSCE rules allowing exemptions to EU travel sanctions. The ongoing war in Ukraine dominated the meeting, with Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha defiantly vowing that justice and victory would prevail.
Ukraine has implemented its largest tax hike since the war began, tripling the military levy from 1.5% to 5% and increasing other taxes to address a $12 billion defense funding gap for 2024. While the new revenue is aimed at military salaries and weapons production, critics warn the measures may strain businesses and fail to address systemic issues like Ukraine's shadow economy.
The tax changes effective December 1st include higher corporate taxes, levies on natural resources and minimum land taxes. Despite generating an estimated $190 million by year-end, the revenue falls short of military needs, with 95% of Ukraine's 2025 domestic budget allocated to defense. Currently, Ukraine's domestic budget cannot fully utilize its growing defense industry's production capacity. However, the potential entry of Norway, Sweden and other countries into funding arrangements could significantly boost Ukraine's defense capabilities beyond what the national budget alone could support. The moves have faced backlash over their limited scope and economic burden on taxpayers. Experts have suggested reforms such as increasing VAT or tackling tax evasion to balance fiscal demands and economic stability amidst ongoing war pressures.
Now, many of the developments regarding the Ukrainian battlefield have in fact been taking place beyond the front lines, and in part within the information sphere. In order to portray Russia's Oreshnik ballistic missile strike against Ukraine, which took place on the 21st of November, as a defensive reaction to the United States allowing Ukraine to launch strikes in Russia using American-provided ATACMS missiles, Russian Chief of the General Staff, Army General Valery Gerasimov, undercut the Kremlin's information campaign. Following the official start of their comprehensive strategic partnership agreement on Wednesday, military cooperation between Russia and North Korea is expected to continue to get stronger in the upcoming months. Now, despite not making any verified advances, Russian forces persisted in their offensive operations towards Pokrovsk. According to Russian sources, Shevchenko and Novopustinka were taken by Russian troops, with Russian forces also launching 40 to 50 infantry assaults in the Pokrovsk direction every day, in groups of about 10 soldiers each, according to the spokesperson for a Ukrainian brigade that operates in that area. Now, as part of the ongoing Russian offensive operations in the region on Thursday, Russian forces recently made progress northwest of Vuhledar. And now here's a quick look at the commemorations of the Day of Armed Forces in Ukraine. And now it's time to take a look at the war in Ukraine through the eyes of a journalist. And for that, we're joined by our correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Kataji. Hello, Oz. Good to see you again.
Good evening.
A snowy night there in Kyiv, a stark reminder that the weather, of course, is also working against the defenders of Ukraine and ordinary people every single day with the blackouts and all that. But today we'll be talking about the celebrations of the Ukraine Armed Forces Day. Let me begin with a quick quote from President Zelenskyy, who said, "Respect, gratitude, honor and goosebumps when we say glory to Ukraine and respond glory to the heroes." Some powerful words there. Would you say that this day is once again special due to the fact that it's not just about honoring the past, like most countries do, it's about honoring the present and future fight against the attempt to essentially undermine Ukraine's very existence and statehood?
Yes, well, I think he made a really interesting parallel in his speech earlier at the ceremony, where he talked about what was happening on Thursday, which was the Budapest Memorandum, the 30 years anniversary of signing the Budapest Memorandum. And then fast forward to Friday, and he linked Armed Forces Day with the Budapest Memorandum. And I think this was really telling, considering the kind of political climate we're heading into. And he said something interesting. He said, "Today we clearly understand that the true, most effective and most reliable guarantor of our security is the armed forces of Ukraine." So, and he finished with, "May death avoid the brave." So, you know, again, this is not really a message of much enthusiasm in the kind of international support that Ukraine has been getting over the last year or so, particularly frustrations with Washington coming to a head as this administration leaves. So again, the kind of idea that Ukraine stands alone and has to rely on its own shoulders is meant both for an international audience and a domestic audience that has been really suffering at the receiving end of this war for 2.5 years, nearly 3 years now.
And now there are new developments as well. The Ukrainian armed forces are not just fighting back, they're developing their own weapons systems. This has been recently announced. New missiles, new long-range drones. So do you think there is a feeling that this may be an approaching turning point, perhaps not in the entire war, but in the way that it is being approached? Because there are also reports from, from the trenches with soldiers saying, well, we don't really hear much about missiles, about the ATACMS and much, because the war is happening here and now. What matters is, the rations, the ammunition for our guns, whether we will be able to be shipped out from this place. We've been here for like weeks or months. So, some very intense comments coming in from the front line sometimes.
Well, listen, I think it comes down to 2 points, really, 2 big questions. The first one being, what is the Trump administration going to do? We know they want to try and impose some kind of ceasefire. How successful they're going to be in that is really, really doubtful. So again, people in Ukraine want there to be some kind of resolution to this, but putting faith in whatever Trump's plans may be might not be the most sensible suggestion, given Trump's unreliability on many things in the past for Kyiv. Now, the second big question is, where does Europe fit into this? If Trump does end military aid, US military aid to Ukraine, does Europe manage to meet that demand? Those are 2 huge question marks. And that really dictates a lot of what happens in 2025. And I feel that there's kind of a frustration here in Ukraine that some of that, that not everything is in their own hands, because they're relying on partners that are at various times in differing positions of reliability when it comes to providing military aid. So a huge, huge amount of questions to be answered as we head into 2025.
Oz Strategy from Kyiv. Oz, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight on the subject. The United States is ramping up support for Ukraine with billions in economic and military aid, even as shifting domestic politics and global tensions complicate the path forward. Between ongoing missile strikes and rare high-level military calls between Washington and Moscow, questions loom about the future of the U.S. involvement in the conflict under the Trump administration.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced on December 4th the release of $50 billion in frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine's economy and defense. Coordinated with the European Union, the funds aim to sustain Ukraine through critical months ahead. This package adds to the $100 billion in U.S. assistance since 2022 and a $700 million weapons package unveiled early December, which includes Stinger missiles, HIMARS ammunition, drones and landmines. U.S. domestic politics remains far from a united front. House Speaker Mike Johnson, a Trump ally, announced he would not advance President Biden's request for $24 billion in additional aid. Johnson argued that such decisions should be made by the next administration following Donald Trump's election victory. Trump has pledged to push for negotiations between Kyiv and Moscow, potentially involving territorial concessions and a halt to Ukraine's NATO ambitions. The Biden administration is accelerating assistance ahead of a potential shift in U.S. policy under Trump, whose approach could fundamentally alter the trajectory of the conflict. All of this comes shortly after a rare call between Russian General Valery Gerasimov and U.S. General Charles Brown Jr. The conversation followed Russia's launch of its Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile at Dnipro, Ukraine. While Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed the strike was retaliation for Ukraine's use of Western weapons, Gerasimov told Brown the launch had been planned much earlier. Analysts suggest the strike was a calculated show of strength rather than escalation, with Putin's subsequent threats to target Kyiv interpreted as an intimidation tactic.
And joining us now to discuss this story even further is Brent Sadler, Senior Fellow at the Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hey, good evening.
So let's begin with the US aid. It has been announced by Secretary Blinken that about 50 billion US dollars in economic aid will be going forward. There has also been a discussion concerning military aid, and that was blocked by Speaker Mike Johnson. So now, can you explain what do you see the path forward being during this difficult period when the old administration is slowly winding down and the Trump administration preparing to take over? Do you think that this gap could actually be something of a window of opportunity, unfortunately, for Russia, which may see, okay, so we have a time to act and we're going to do all that we can to increase our gains before a potential moment for negotiations?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would characterize it as a window of opportunity just for Putin. It's also a window of opportunity for the Ukrainians under President Zelenskyy as well. I mean, since this invasion in 2022 started, there has not been a clear strategy or plan by the Biden administration, and it devolved to this war of attrition, which is very much in character with the way the Russians prefer to fight. And it's definitely spoken to their advantages. And so what still is lacking, even in this final days of the Biden administration, is a plan forward, continuing to provide economic aid, which is not the priority and has run into many questions because it is not being tracked or traced as it should be, but not as many questions with military assistance, the provision of munitions, weapon systems like missiles. These things are less of an issue, but again, there is no strategy behind either of them that gets to an end. So I think what we have right now coming from an incoming administration is a very forceful intention: come to the negotiating table or else. And when it comes into what that or else is with regards to an incoming Trump administration, look at how he dealt with by ratcheting up the pressure campaign against North Korea, which then eventually gave way to a détente of sort, no missile test, no nuclear test, and the opening of much more friendly, or at least on the surface, friendly relations for a while with North Korea. That likely is what we could see in the coming months, assuming that there isn't a breakthrough on the Russian part.
Well, that's a crucial question, right? I mean,
yes.
The difference with North Korea was that that was not a situation of a direct military conflict. The tensions were, of course, quite substantial. They still are. But with Ukraine, every single day counts. I mean, we've just had our correspondent saying that Ukrainians were frustrated with the Biden administration and with the way they handled things. But they also have a feeling of apprehension what's going to happen next. And in the meantime, every single day that passes without military aid may cost lives on the front line, may cost the livelihoods of towns and cities taken by the Russians. So would you say that it is the best option to actually make it more difficult for Ukraine to obtain aid from the US during that period? Or wouldn't it be more productive to send very clear signals that, okay, look, we're going to send the aid until this cutoff point, which is going to be the inauguration of President Trump. After that, however, a new era begins, and both the Ukrainians and the Russians need to sit down at the table. And this is where the or else part would come into play.
Yeah, I mean, from the vantage point here in Washington, D.C., in my personal view of what I've seen in the information, is it looks like both Russia and Ukraine are reaching a point at which, a culminating point, where they cannot continue fighting as they have been. For Ukraine, I think you had earlier in your earlier segment mention of new weapon systems, cruise missiles, and the tunes of several hundred, which Ukraine can employ as they see fit, which quite frankly, all of the weapons that had been given to Ukraine should have been used as they saw most militarily effective. So I think Russia sees that Ukraine's industrial capacity is starting to ratchet up, certainly not to match it, but at the same time that the Russian people are going to be increasingly targeted and that the war is going to be brought home to them. So the sooner that Putin can get to a ceasefire or a conclusion of this fight, I think it also serves his interest. Right now, in the next few weeks, it's a matter of trying to ensure that the entering argument, their position, the territory they control, can allow them to negotiate from a position of strength. And I think that's the issue. And when it comes to military arms, that's the real question. And it's not just the U.S. that continues to provide military assistance, but also other European countries. And that I don't see necessarily slacking in a way that would really risk a breakout from the Russian side. The economic aid, however, politically, not something that is very sustainable from D.C.
And why is that so? I mean, Ukraine does require lots of funds for not just for rebuilding. I mean, that comes later, even though Ukraine is trying to rebuild some of the parts of the infrastructure, even as the war rages on, but also the daily functioning of the state. One perhaps is, led to think, okay, Ukraine doesn't have the same capacity as Russia does. Russia has plenty of offshore funds, hidden pathways for funding to come in, and is quite adept at evading sanctions. So would you say that perhaps more attention should be brought to how to make Russia more willing to negotiate in good faith, if it ever does negotiate in good faith, by ratcheting up economic pressure on its international interests, like the uranium trade, the oil trade also, which is still a thing?
We'll have a lot more confidence that a new President Trump administration will be able to get that balance right than what we've seen in the last 4 years under the Biden administration, quite frankly. And that is dealing from a position of strength. And again, I go back to, and I think the Russians are also very aware of how President Trump has dealt with the Iranians by killing General Soleimani and how that tamped down the aggression that we saw to Tehran for a while, as well as the pressure campaign with North Korea. So they're very much aware in Moscow what Trump is willing to do if they don't come to the table, at least in good faith, to negotiate. That doesn't mean that the solution will be in good faith and sustainable. I think we have to continue to be very vigilant going forward. Certainly the people in Trump coming back into power here in D.C. are clear-eyed on that point.
And do you think that it will be possible to convince Ukrainians? Many of them are looking at the new administration, as I said, with apprehension. They can also see the discourse in the United States. There are some journalists and commentators who are seemingly resentful towards a nation at war, a nation that was attacked. There are some conspiracy theories making the rounds. Some people do tend to believe them. They say that perhaps it is Ukraine that's in the wrong and Russia might actually have some convincing arguments. Well, looking from the Eastern European perspective, like Ukraine, Poland, countries that had to deal with the Putin regime and with Russia in general, well, we can see that Russia invents arguments just in order to advance its own cause, often a cause of conquest. So would you say that perhaps this is something that has to be addressed as well to some extent?
Well, I don't think any clear-eyed people here are serious thinkers on either side of the political aisle take much consideration of these very wild claims, one way or the other, either anti-Ukrainian or anti-Russian. But what has unfortunately happened here in the last several years is that Ukraine, their political leadership, has aligned themselves with a partisan perspective. They have aligned themselves with the Democrat Party during the presidential campaign. Some unfortunate events that their ambassador involved themselves with made it look like that they were playing American politics, and this is not a good look.
Or do you think that this was their intention, or was it just something that to some extent could not have been avoided? I mean, the visit at the ammunition factory, well, it could be played, it could be understood as being political, but also it was really about showing that we support Ukraine, we manufacture ammunition, and we bring jobs to the American people. So, I mean, there is that counter-argument there.
There is, but the images and several other, the most visible is one you mentioned, that go back for like a year past. It was not helpful. And I think this is something with the new administration, President Zelenskyy needs to find a new way to engage President Trump and to get assurances that they will be a reliable partner and that what had happened in the partisan past is in the past.
Do you believe that, on the other hand, Russia can ever be a reliable partner? We can see that Russia doesn't really intend to commit itself to a lasting peace. Recently, there has been this leaked, perhaps accidentally, perhaps more likely purposely, so-called plan for the future of Ukraine, which sees a part of Ukraine annexed, another part of Ukraine subjugated politically, and the third one apparently ripped apart with the help of other countries, which are not really interested in doing that, obviously. But do you think that Russia basically is just trying to buy time? What if it transpires that this is what it is? They're just preparing for another attack.
Well, that's why earlier I mentioned we have to remain vigilant. Certainly, Europe needs to take care of spending more resources to bolster its defenses. It was never the end of history where war would never return, major war, to Europe. It only was because there was adequate military defenses that could deter adventures like we're seeing now in Ukraine. So if that lesson is lost, then yeah, we're going to be reliving this problem again.
And would you say that the problem lies with countries that simply do not understand the gravity of the situation? We have a certain disparity between countries in the East, which understand that and which have ramped up their spending quite substantially. But on the other hand, other countries which are struggling with the 2% requirement, which, given the sheer size of their economies, may look a bit problematic, to say the least.
Well, the reality of the world is it's much more dangerous. And so the 2% is the floor. The 3% is becoming the new goal for NATO, as we heard out this past summer. These countries in Europe, I think the time where we could reliably assume that war or conflict wouldn't visit their shores is past. And what matters now is what they do. Countries like Spain, Italy, France, and the UK all I think need to take different lessons, but all need to spend more in their defense. The United States, it's not lost that many in Eastern Europe have and know very well the Russian threat and have for many years, not just in the recent past, for several years, been investing in their defense. That lesson, I hope, is echoed throughout all of Europe. But the United States has bigger, more dangerous concerns in Asia that it also has to address. And that's a reality, a strategic reality, that also, if not handled well in Asia, will impact the safety, security, and prosperity of Europe as well.
So it is a question of shared responsibility for the common security, which after all is the very foundational principle of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Brent Sadler was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
As the war progresses into winter, questions surrounding Ukraine's future and the path to peace remain pressing. With NATO pushing for more military aid and Turkey rejecting any plan involving territorial concessions, the focus remains on strengthening Ukraine's position before potential negotiations.
Speaking ahead of the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, Mark Rutte emphasized strengthening Ukraine's position on the battlefield to negotiate from a point of power. He dismissed premature discussions on peace processes, calling for more military aid and less discussions to counter Russia's continued territorial advances.
But we must do more than just keep Ukraine in the fight.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has signaled a willingness to cede temporarily occupied territories in exchange for NATO membership, a significant shift from his previous stance. He acknowledged Ukraine's current military limitations in reclaiming all occupied areas, including Crimea. However, Zelenskyy remains firm on NATO membership as a cornerstone for Ukraine's security. Meanwhile, Turkey has rejected peace plans that involve freezing the conflict or territorial concessions to Moscow. Ukrainian lawmaker Artem Chigyoz confirmed Ankara's continued support for Ukraine's sovereignty, including over Crimea, following high-level meetings. Turkey also emphasized the importance of maintaining Western military aid to Ukraine, despite geopolitical shifts, including the incoming US administration under President-elect Donald Trump. His call for a swift resolution to the war has fueled anxiety in Kyiv, as his proposed ceasefire terms may favor Moscow. Trump's team has suggested freezing territorial lines and halting NATO expansion. Meanwhile, NATO allies including Germany and the US have pledged millions in additional arms and air defenses to sustain Ukraine's efforts amid worsening battlefield conditions. Russia remains opposed to negotiations unless its territorial claims, including annexed regions and Crimea, are recognized. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov reiterated this stance, rejecting Turkey's proposed peace plan involving territorial concessions and a demilitarized zone. NATO leaders and Ukrainian officials have stressed that a settlement granting Russia territorial legitimacy would embolden aggression.
And joining us now to discuss the topic is Yevgenia Kravchuk, Deputy Chair at the Ukrainian Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So a peace plan, it's something that's quite distant, but it is beginning to take shape, at least a ceasefire plan perhaps. What would you say are the priorities for Ukraine right now? Because there are many concepts appearing in the West, including those that would involve Ukraine making huge sacrifices. But what do the Ukrainians think, the Ukrainian administration and the Ukrainian people?
Well, first of all, we do not have any official peace plan plans, whatever you call them, except those that were introduced by Ukrainian side, by President Zelenskyy, these 5 points of victory plan and the peace formula and so on and so forth. If we might assume that there will be probably some proposal from future Donald J. Trump administration, then obviously we would have to wait until it becomes official, and all of the, this national security advisors, the Department of State head will assume that, will come to their office. Obviously, because it's already the administration in transition, they do start to receive the intelligence data of U.S. intelligence systems and more information rather than it was during the political campaign. And of course, we understand that when political campaigns is on the run, politicians, they use these short and simple solutions as 24 hours and the war will be over. But in Ukraine, we of course understand that it's much more complicated. And what do? We of course getting stronger, getting ready. Even now, even today, we introduced a new drone, the deep strike drone called the Hell. That Ukrainian army will be using against the invaders.
So, of course, Ukraine is preparing for further military activities. At the same time, it is thinking about what is going to happen. The country's foreign minister said that there will be no Yalta 2 and no Minsk 3. These are the words of Andriy Sybiha. And it's quite important to emphasize, because he said that this doesn't work. If we do it again, we're going to see more mass graves, more war crimes committed by the Russians in the future. So do you believe that this is something that can yet change? Because we have heard signals from the new administration, from people involved with the administration, that some of the territories would not be coming back to Ukraine. They might be coming back diplomatically in some unspecified future. But then we also have a voice from Turkey, and they say, look, territorial sovereignty must be respected. And Turkey being an important player, one that can engage with both sides, do you think that perhaps the specter of forcing Ukraine to give away territories, which, from a moral standpoint, a legal standpoint, that would be wrong, but some politicians might have been tempted to try that. Do you think this specter is perhaps slightly more distant now, as voices of support begin to emerge, voices of support for Ukraine?
Well, first of all, no Ukrainian politician can say that we, give up officially, make sacrifice on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It's written in our constitution. It's illegal. It's unthinkable of. There are though conflicts. For example, Cyprus having the part of the north still under occupation. They do not have a control of this part of the country, and it's been for more than 50 years. Very sad. We would not want to have 50 years ahead to get back our territorial integrity. But in meantime, in these 50 years, Cyprus joined European Union. And Ukraine also understands that military way to liberate all of the occupied territories will mean, it's just too much of human lives. And as we see how Europe and the whole Western world is prepared for the full scale, war, we just do not produce. They do not produce enough of weapons as autocracies. North Korea, which not speaking about just Russia, Iran, North Korea. It was obvious some support from the Chinese parts that are used in drones and missiles. So we do understand that it will need diplomatic solution to restore the territorial integrity. But not President Zelenskyy, not any other Ukrainian politician will say, okay, for tomorrow, we forget about all occupied territories. The world order is over. The world order that we've known since the Second World War is no longer exist, and each country is behaving as it wants.
Do you think, ironically enough, Russia can actually help obtain a better solution, in that Russia is going to say, we have our goals in Ukraine, we want to denazify, all the nonsense that they have been saying for years now. We know it makes no sense. We know when Mr. Lavrov comes into a room, we know that he's just going to lie through his teeth all the time. But the thing is, Russia might not be willing to negotiate at all. They might say, no, we're not going to give up. We're not going to withdraw our forces. We're not going to respect a ceasefire. Do you think that in that case, the new US administration is going to say, okay, so we're actually going to give Ukraine more weapons, and in its intransigence, Russia will bring upon itself a renewed offensive from the Ukrainians and begin to lose the territories that it has taken illegally? So that's, of course, it's a hypothetical question, but there are many indications Russia is not really interested in negotiating in good faith. Do you think the American administration might see that and say, well, we warned you, so now it's plan B. Ukraine is getting more weapons than it did before?
Well, it is possible, and if you follow the interview from Konstantin Malofeyev, who is the oligarch, the Orthodox oligarch, and very close to Putin, he said something about that, Russia is not going to do what the West wants and blah, blah, blah. And Kit Kellogg, who will be obviously the special envoy or special representative of President Trump and the American administration with regards to the war of Russia against Ukraine, he said that this tycoon has to return to the box where it got out, because Russians probably do not understand who Donald J. Trump is. And obviously Trump does want to have a good deal, to look like a winner in this situation. And the official position of Kremlin right now, to begin the negotiations, just to start the negotiations, negotiations about the ceasefire, Ukraine has to withdraw from the regions which were written in Russian constitution, and they're not totally controlled by Russia. For example, Russia does not control any of the regional centers, for example, Zaporizhia or Kherson. Kherson was liberated in 2022, in autumn of 2022, but they put whole region into Russian constitution. So basically, Kremlin says that Ukraine has to withdraw from unoccupied territories, which sounds as a complete nonsense, and I'm pretty sure that administration of Trump will understand that that Russians just want to make fool of all the Western world, given these conditions to talk about the ceasefire. On the other hand, Ukraine does control part of Russian territory in Kursk region. And it's something that, was like a black swan. Of course, Russians will put everything and push in all possible means, military means, to push out our troops from Kursk region before January 20th. But they're not very lucky yet.
And do you think there is still this conviction among European leaders, among US leaders? It is interesting to what extent the new leadership actually believes that, because there used to be this concept that Russia is too big to fail. To use a parallel with, with a story from the banking sector, that we cannot allow this country to fall because it would be more danger if it started to collapse than if it remains as it is. Do you think that perhaps this rather problematic assumption in foreign policy is what really is the key here? Because it does seem like some countries are using sanctions, but not too much. Okay, so not too much, because they might be thinking, oh, what if we actually have a collapsing Russian regime on our hands? What are we going to do then? They don't really see the benefits of that, just the possible issues and problems that it may bring.
Well, we did have another example in history. It was Soviet Union and the collapse of Soviet Union. At one point, some Western leaders were a bit afraid of Soviet Union collapsing. Remember this famous Chicken Kyiv speech that Senior Bush gave in Kyiv. asking, to stay in the Soviet Union. But as we saw, actually it worked well in the point that the collective West does not have a clear view of the future Russia if Ukraine wins. That is true. And it does need some more work with Western leaders to speak more about colonial past of Russia and from which part actually Russia consists, because only a small European part of Russian Federation stays on the European continent. Other than that, it's completely Asian country with different republics that were oppressed all this time.
And a quick final question. What role do you think countries like Brazil, countries like Turkey, for example, the Global South generally may play in this upcoming peace process? Because we have often mentioned that their outlook is slightly different than ours, but they also hold a powerful sway in terms of foreign policy. It is said that, for example, India and China might have dissuaded Russia from doing unspeakable things involving nuclear weapons. To what extent Russia is willing to do that? Well, that's an open question. Perhaps we may never know. But do you think that the Global South would also need to be involved in that and would need to receive more information on what it really means for the region, to put it shortly?
Well, of course, the Russian propaganda is much stronger in Global South than it is in European Union now, though still quite strong, or United States. And the different countries of Global South are actually differently involved. For example, the Arabic countries, Kuwait especially, or Saudi Arabia, and Turkey as well, Turkey, helped us with actual negotiation to exchange the prisoners of war, abducted children that Russia kept. So basically, they already had some positive impact, though they say, we are sort of neutral. And actually, Turkey closed the Bosphorus at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and Russian ships could not enter from Mediterranean Sea to Black Sea, and it did influence in a positive way for Ukraine, because actually Odessa was not captured, and the big part of south of Ukraine was not occupied. But I'm pretty sure that all these big countries still want to have to live in the world with rules, and they do understand that violating the rules-based order means that tomorrow there will be no rules for anyone. And they do have and feel the pressure from China, for example, especially in the Indo-Pacific. For example, such countries as India, they are rivals with China, though being, sort of neutral. So we are open to work with different countries, but all these different countries should say that, for example, the United Nations Charter is still existing, and there is respect for the internationally recognized borders.
So the fundamental policy of international law have to be complied with, something that Russia would require a lot of convincing to actually agree to, if ever, as we've seen throughout history, of course. Evgenia Kravchuk was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all for today. Join us at the same time next week for more latest news and updates from Ukraine. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.